To the fourth seminar in the Critical Perspectives on Youth, Community and Urban Regeneration seminar series, which will be delivered by Dr. John Bissett. The seminar series is very kindly sponsored by the Department of Sociology, the Irish Social Sciences Platform and the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences in UL. The speaker today, John Bissett, is a community worker with the Canal Communities Local Drugs Task Force in Dublin, and he's been a member of the St Michael's Estate Regeneration team since 2001. John is no stranger to UL or Limerick for that matter, and he's spoken here on a number of occasions over the last number of years. In 2008 he published a book, Regeneration, Public Good or Private Profit, which was probably one of the most insightful books I ever read in terms of the role of the state and laying that bare in terms of how regeneration processes occur. I suppose no less an authority than Kathleen Lynch said what was unique about that particular book is that it documents how the process of housing regeneration works from the inside, from the perspectives of those being regenerated. And it shows in a very raw form where power lies in any partnership for regeneration between the state and those who are being regenerated. Today John will talk to us about the regeneration process in St Michael's Estate, the state's decision to use public-private partnership as a template for regeneration. And his presentation will focus on the community's attempt to use and have democratic and egalitarian models of regeneration delivered. So I'll hand you over to John now.
Okay, thanks very much, Martin. Thanks very much for having me. There's a few familiar faces that I know from coming up and down, and from people from here coming up to Dublin to be involved in stuff that we do. I work as a community worker in Dublin. I work for an organisation which is predominantly about sorting out serious and problematic heroin use. But my job is to work as a community worker. And I suppose in the last 10, 11 years, housing has been a big issue. In the area that I work in, it's sort of south inner city, there's a number of old urban flat complexes. We have Falmouth Mansions, Dolphin House, St Michael's Estate and Bernard Curtis House. So the old kind of iconic city council flat complexes, there's a number of them within that area, and they came up for regeneration. So that would be how that would have become a big part of the work that I do on the ground on a daily basis. Just as a way of starting, for me it helps me to put this in some sort of context, the work that I do, and to help me to give a shape to it. And I come at it from an equality perspective. And this is a framework that some of you may have seen or not seen. It's in a book called Equality from Theory to Action. Kathleen Lynch, John Baker, Judy Walsh, Sarah Kentelholm, people in the Equality Studies Department, UCD, put it together. And really it's about an attempt to understand the social context in which we work, right? And for me, it gives you a multi-layered perspective on the inequalities that you face. So some people carry class as their key inequality when that's the foundational cause. This gives you a more, as I said, sort of multi-layered gender, race, disability, age, and what they do is give you a framework for trying to understand the social landscape in which you're working. And they break it into, they've got a kind of diagram, but they basically say we can understand inequality at a general level, right, by looking at it in these 5 areas. In terms of resources, so what do you own, what do you have? You've got income, but you've also got wealth coming in. And, your class position is really defined by what resources you have or what access to resources that you have. What power do you have? I think as Weber says, that power is about having the ability to get your way, right, to influence other people, to convince them that your way is the right way. But lots of things feed into that. Your resources feed into your power as well in the context of how you get your status, how you get your respect. So that's it. It is another key relationship. You're working and learning. Like Kathleen Lynch herself has written a lot about inequalities in the context of education. Why some groups have much more access to education than others, right? Why some groups have much more satisfying work, right? options and opportunities available to them in the context of what they do every day. And that it doesn't have to be that way. We can structure our working lives in much different ways where people get to change over and have a much better opportunity of doing work which is satisfying, which is interesting, which is rewarding. And there's a whole hierarchy in there of what sort of work is defined as valuable. Right? So there's different dynamics within that. Respect and recognition. So, like, in the context of the landscape that I work in and where I grew up, and I think it's familiar in lots of the landscapes that I visited in Limerick, is the idea of how you're treated, right? Whether it's by your accent, your physical, as Bourdieu says, your physical appearance, and how you come into a space in that way, in terms of why do some groups or some people get much more instantaneous respect and recognition than others in that way. And people tell you those stories. They tell you about the jobs and the address and being in those spaces, and feeling there's something different or there's a dynamic going on in the room that I can't explain, but I do know that there's something happening, and that's that, if you're gay, if you're black, if you're working class, that level of respect and recognition may not be the same in particular situations. They have a category called love, care and solidarity, and it's a kind of something they've added to the mix. A lot of the other stuff has been taken over from Marx or from Weber in the context of older sociological categories, but this idea is kind of new in a way of both in terms of your ability or capacity to receive relationships of love, care and solidarity. So if you're a prisoner, for instance, what access do you have in terms of visits at that level, but also or if you're somebody in care, right, the quality of that care and the relationships that, for instance, the state and how it works with people in care and institutional care over many decades, but also in relation to trying to get care for people and inequalities within the system. If you have an elderly parent and you need care, and accessing that care in relation to cost and so on within the state. So it's a framework. It can be challenged. You can bounce off and go, I don't like this, I don't like that. It doesn't contain everything. It doesn't claim to contain everything. But for me, it's a kind of multi-dimensional thing that you can bring to the work and say, it gives us something which we can put around the problem and look at it from the inside. Well, like that book that Martin talked about, there's something that needs to be theorised in a more extensive way. And this is perhaps one way that can help us to theorise what's going on within that context. So my basic argument would be that we should have a fundamentally much more equal Ireland. Right? It's very simple, right? In that sense of, and that's where we need to get to in a resource sense, in a working learning and power, in relation to respect and recognition that the way our society is currently structured it's profoundly unequal, and we need to change that. And the spaces that we work in are representations of those inequalities in all sorts of different ways. So it just helps me to place the work within a context and an understanding. Michael Taft is an economics research officer with United Trade Union, and he has a blog called Notes on the Front, and he has an article in it recently called Poorer but not necessarily more unequal. The gist of the article is that as a society we may be getting poorer, right, in terms of the overall block of resources, but we don't need to become more unequal, right? And that relationship really, what it really means is that as the resources decrease, the gap is getting bigger. So this is it measures the distribution of resources between the top 20% and the bottom 20%, only in relation to income, not in relation to wealth, right? If you put wealth in that, it would be much greater. But Ireland is 5th from the top of the inequality measurement in Europe on the 2010 figure, which is the most recent data available. But on the year before that, it was down at about 4.3 or 4.2, right? So, and it's the biggest single increase of any European member state in relation to its inequality levels in the history of the European Union over that short period of time, right? So, just to put it in context, not only the top 20% of our society are becoming richer while the bottom 20% are becoming poorer. But that's telling you factually that that's the case, right? We know that instinctively on the ground in terms of who's being cut, what's being taken away, resource teachers, community projects, all of that stuff. Right? But it's taken from the CSO household, the household income survey information. Right? But it's a really key piece of information in relation to where we're moving as a society generally. In that way. Okay, just to move into the projects themselves, the idea of regeneration, and just to put it in a little bit of context, like I worked in St Michael's Estate. I became part of what was called a regeneration team, which effectively was a group of community workers, residents, activists who came together to say the state was proposing that regeneration happen. So in St Michael's Estate, which is on the south side of the city of Dublin, had about 14 blocks over about 14 acres of land. In 1998, DCC, along with local organisations and residents, carried out a survey, and the decision was to demolish. Right? So the regeneration processes begin. It begins at Ballymun, right? And then it begins to be talked about in other areas. Now, the case in St Michael's Estate that we tell in the book was that in 2003, a state-funded plan was made ready for the estate, which would have cost about 63 million euros from start to finish to be completed. Right? We spent about 2 years putting it all together, getting the architects, the consultants, doing all the different plans, finishing it up, and then handing it over to the planning authority and working on it to say, will you pass that, and we'll start building as soon as the money comes on stream. Right? So it went forward for planning, but the DOE, the Department of Environment, said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. What we're going to do is we're going to use the model of public-private partnership that they had used previously on toll roads, but they had never used on housing. Right? And I'll explain the PPP model as we go along. Right? But effectively, it was a completely different model. And what it did was it gave builders and developers a section of the land on an estate. It gave them the land for free in return that they build a set number of houses and community facilities. Right? But the idea for the state was that it didn't cost anything, right, for them, but the builder got to build. The builder got to build the social aspect of the estate, and then they got to build relatively as many private apartments as they wanted to sell to cover the cost of building the other stuff. Do you get that? Just so it's a kind of a quid pro quo, right? So the Michael's Estate example is 14 acres of land. They were to build 165 public housing units, but they were going to build 370 private units. They were going to sell them for anywhere between 300,000 and €500,000 euros each, and that would fund the cost of the social infrastructure, plus they would get about 15 to 20% profit, and possibly even more. Right? So that was a simple logic of it. It's quite a tautological logic, right? That the circle is supposed to contain itself within that, right? But the logic, it didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed within this larger housing bubble that we had going on all the time, right? But we'd ask questions about, like, does PPP really work for housing? You know, yes it does, it's fine, it's great. And you'd be in meetings where it took us a long time to negotiate the public aspects of the project with people who are now in Limerick, who would tell us, you can't have that many public housing units. It doesn't fit. The model doesn't work. It costs too much money, right? So they go out of the room. They come back in with a sheet of paper saying you need to bring your numbers down. So we eventually struck a deal on the numbers, and we entered in. We spent 4 years on PPP developing the project up to the time of where a number of developers put their bids in, and one of them was chosen as the preferred bidder, which in that case was Bernard McNamara and Castlethorne, the construction company. They were given 5 PPP projects in Dublin. They had St Michael's Estate, they had O'Devaney Gardens, they had Dominic Street, and they had 2 other sites, one in Sean McDermott Street and one up near O'Devaney Gardens on the North Circular Road up there. In May 2008, we had been saying to McNamara, are you going to sign the contract, right, for the build? And he eventually got up and said, no, there's not enough money in it. He knew he was in huge debt, he had huge problems, and he walked away. He walked away from the 5 of them overnight. Right? The only PPP project to go ahead in housing was Fallon Mansions. Right? Ballymun is a completely different animal. It was part state funded, mostly state funded. as a regeneration project. So they were, in a way, the flagship projects that were to come on stream, and there was a whole host of other city council projects and Limerick, which was to come after that in the context of similar economic structures, right, in the sense of this is how the projects will work, right? But when they collapsed, everything collapsed, right? So Dolphin House, second largest complex after Ballymun, there was a whole conveyor belt of public housing complexes that were ready to go along that line to follow suit, right? The same idea, the private housing sales pay for the public aspects, it's off balance sheet and it doesn't cost the state anything. So it looks great on paper, it's fantastic, you're getting all of this stuff for nothing. Right? There were key problems at the time, even within the model. Who was going to live in the units? Were they real? Were they really houses for real people? And we know now that they weren't, right? That at least half of them were going to be bought just as speculative investments to sell them on the next stage of the ladder, right? So all of these projects collapsed in May 2008, and it was, there were lots of people, especially the residents who lived on the estates, completely in shock. Just the time, the investment, sites ready to go, all of this, preparatory work that had gone in to get everything up to speed. Like we spent months that we discussed in the book on the assessment panel, right, looking at all of the bids and going through all of that process, which is really interesting in itself. In the context of how that whole structure works. So what the City Council did was it set up a housing task force, and they effectively said at that time that these projects will be delivered over the longer term, right? So we'll try and hold, for instance, the McNamara plan for Michael's estate, we'll try and hold that plan, but we can't do it now. Now since then they've given up, right? The McNamara plan used to be in an office in St. Michael's estate in the middle, and the last time I went in it had disappeared, right? Like him, to somewhere else. So it's not there anymore, right? And that's effectively what's happened. They've just completely been abandoned in terms of the idea that they would build them over the longer term somehow. One of the issues that's coming to the fore for us now, Martin, you just tell me at the time, will you? Yeah, no. Is one of our worries is what happens to the land, right? So most of those projects were with the housing section of the City Council, right? But more recently they've begun to shift the projects away from the housing section into the Economic Development Unit of DCC, right? Which is a key strategic shift. And one of our fundamental concerns now is that really they'll become part of the larger acid fire sale that's taking place, right? That they'll somehow be wangled into that. And one of the key ways you do that is by kind of suppressing or reducing or getting rid of any resistance or articulation that the land should be used for democratic and egalitarian public uses on into the future, right? So that, I don't know whether that's happening there, we can talk about it when we get to the discussion bit. That's a key issue in the sense of that even if the build doesn't happen, right, that believe it or not, the land is still really valuable and it's still really important, and it can have all sorts of uses where somebody is not given it at a fire sale price, and then they literally can put a fence around and say it's mine and I'll sit on it for another 10 years because property will go back up again and so on, right? Because St. Michael's estate is completely empty, there aren't any tenants left, and so are a lot of the other regeneration projects, maybe one or two heading in that direction. I just thought that I'd give you 4 examples, right, of 4 complexes in the city, in the sense of what's been happening with them. O'Devney Gardens is on the north side of the city, right next to the Phoenix Park. Brilliant location, close to the city. So all these estates are in amazing spaces, and I know, same here in Limerick, South Hills location, in the context of that they are really valuable and spaces to have. When I started working on the regeneration stuff 9 or 10 years ago, the first meeting I went to, there were 248 occupied flats in O'Devney Gardens out of 276, right? Some people had moved out at that stage, right? O'Devney went through exactly the same process that St. Michael's did. It went through the development of a PPP master plan. I was over there last Thursday to take some photographs, and Lena and Fidelma, who worked there, were just talking me through there were supposed to be about 700 housing units, affordable, public and private, and a host of community facilities. The estate was to be opened up around the North Circular Road and to allow, permeability is the big architectural buzzword they use, right, about people flowing through these beautiful public spaces. But the same thing happened there. The PPP collapsed, same builder, same developer, up and just walked away and left it. Now, it's about 6 or 7 years since that I was at, there's only 40 to 50 occupied flats, and the demolition was going on full tilt last Thursday over there. The whole top end of the site was completely cleared. They had said to people on the demo, you will never move, you haven't got houses for you, right? But they now have it down to about 40 or 50 people. And what happens is it's intolerable, right? It becomes intolerable, especially whatever about surviving on your own as an adult. If you have children, right, to live in spaces like that, with all of that stuff going on, and then the blocks themselves are physically deteriorating, the plumbing, there's leaks, there's nobody investing any money in keeping you together. And you end up in situations where in some blocks you may have a single family in a block of 12 or 16 flats, and what people are doing a lot these days is they're trying to get in to steal the copper, right? So they're taking the whole plumbing system out around you, and you get flooded time and again. They were just telling me about a woman who had lived in the block on her own for a couple of years because she wanted a particular space to live in, and she got it eventually, but she had to endure hell living in the block. But most people are in that position now in the context of trying to sustain themselves, and people here that have that know the experiences that I'm talking about are comparative in Limerick. What happened with the PPPs was, and from community pressure, Falmouth would have put forward a model of having community-based regeneration boards. So the challenge was, if you're going to be in this struggle to define what's going to go on the land, if you're going to get in the game, what are the best sorts of structures that we can have? So the idea was to get somebody, a chair, who would articulate and be on your side, articulate for the community and advocate, and be an advocate for the community. So you had somebody like Finbar Flood, who was the former CEO of Guinness's and chairperson of the Labour Court, who became the chairperson of Falmouth and then St Michael's Estate. And they had a barrister who took over in Devonry Gardens. But the idea behind the structures simply was that communities could control them and determine the agenda, right? But that's a struggle. Sometimes that swings up for you and sometimes it doesn't, right? I think it's been more difficult here in that sense of trying to get that. But the problem now is that effectively the board in Devonry has been dismantled, right? It still exists in name, but it doesn't really work in any sense of engaging people who are left. It's really about running the complex, running the clock down on the complex till it's completely empty. The other thing that's happened there is there was key people who worked with community residents on participation, on plans, on involvement, tenant participation, all that sort of stuff. Community Technical Aid used to have 2 full-time people on Devonry Gardens. Dublin City Council cut that funding completely, both of them were let go. And Lena Jordan, who used to work in the community project there, was also let go. They redefined the job not to include regeneration anymore. So there's a parallel process of disempowering the community sector very strategically and taking away any of that articulated resistance through that used to feed into the structures while getting on with the other agenda. So what they were telling me last Friday is the problem they have at the moment is they've little or no information. These are just photos, that's a block of flats. That's one of I think that block was being demolished last Thursday when I was there. Devonry Gardens at the top end. Really what the purpose behind the photograph is this is the end game. This is where you end up. So the idea behind regeneration was that they would be rebuilt, restructured, put up again, but that hasn't happened. This is where we've got to. Lena gave me this photograph from Devonry Gardens last week. I don't want to tell you a depressing story, right? But I want to tell you how real it is, right? But there's been a huge amount of community action over the years to try and advocate for a just and equality-based model of regeneration. This is a photograph from outside the City Council in Dublin with Tenants First, which is a network of organisations which publish documents like this, Housing for Need, Not for Grades. We might talk a bit about it. And really just, again, was a broader front about bringing complexes together, and it's still working today, right? In the sense of saying, public housing is important, community facilities are important, we need to deliver it, this stuff needs to happen, right? Now, it's been a real struggle and a real challenge in the context of the running down of the complexes. And what's happening currently. Michael's Estate, 14 acres, brilliant location between St Patrick's Athletic Football Ground and the Lewis Line in Inchicore. It has a really historical significance. It used to be Richmond Barracks pre-1916, then it became a tenement. But the older buildings from the barracks, the last ones, became a public school. A good few of the people from 1916 were held in the gymnasium of the school buildings before being taken to Kilmainham Jail. So there's a really huge, significant historical heritage there. And the first graveyard opened after Catholic emancipation in 1848. The historians will tell you afterwards, is on that site as well, right? So there's a real resonance on the land in that way. But similar process to O'Devaney in the sense of just going that same parallel mirror processes with McNamara walking away in 1998, and the same process of de-tenanting the estate gradually, right up until about 12 or 15 months ago, when the last 3 women who were on the estate got houses in and around Rialto, Inchicore and Trimna, and the 3 of them have said they want back, right? Because there's some of the good things about Michael. Because of the campaign, we got John Gormley to give us $7.5 million from the budget before the Fianna Fáil Green government imploded to build 2 acres. It doesn't seem like a lot, but there are 75 public housing units on it. And there's a new creche right to begin. So to us, that's a huge physical and symbolic victory, even though it's not the massive master plan, and we've had to step back and say, okay, there's another 2 acres next to it beside the historic buildings, we'll get them done. And there's a whole series of ideas and proposals for the rest of the land in St Michael's. These are just that block is actually being demolished. There's about 10 acres of land which runs from the front right down to the back. So one of the challenges we have here ourselves now is what do you do? What can we do on the land, right? So there's idea, what cultural uses can we put on it? Can we have an outdoor theatre space? What recreational uses can it have for young people, for children, right? If it's properly done, right? So there's ideas, there's already one of those AstroTurf pitches. Is there something it could have a recreational use in that space? Can you use it for public open air markets, right? If you look at the spaces from another angle, what arts uses can it have within that space? So that's something we're beginning to think about at the moment. Like in the past, we visited places like Coyne Street in London on the South Bank, where what they did was they got Thatcher to sell them the land for £1 million in 1983. Right? And they took a mortgage on it, and they developed the whole site themselves. Now it's a slightly different model, but it's a really interesting place to visit in terms of what they've done with it since. Public park, lots of social housing, 4 different social housing developments. They've got pubs and restaurants right through the site. It's a really interesting development of potential ideas. So that idea, that's a whole aspect of the world that's only coming to the fore now. If you're not going to build houses on it, what can we do with these sites? So I think there's an onus on us to begin to think past the piece where they really were predominantly about housing. Just another complex, St Teresa's Gardens, off Cork Street in the south inner city. A lot of the complexes had about 300, 320, 340 units there, and the rate of de-tenanting is just, it's so, it doesn't seem, it takes a bit of time, but in relative terms, they're de-tenanting the complex really quickly. There's 2 main sets of blocks, one on the left-hand side and one on the right-hand side as you go down. The whole right-hand side of the complex is empty, right? And they've gone through the same process there of, you end up with a couple of families living in a block. The idea is to try and consolidate them all into the fuller blocks, but the process continues apace. The one problem that the City Council is saying it has is that it hasn't got the budgets to purchase the units quick enough to get them out, because if it did have the money to purchase the units quick enough, it's highly likely that the place would be detenanted by the end of the year in that sense. But the problem with that is that it's not just about families, right? Families have extended families and extended families within those areas and those spaces. And that social fabric, like people go, there's no value here, but there's huge value for people in those networks and that fabric that they've built up over generations, and that's been fractured and splintered and broken up very quickly over a period of time in those spaces. So in 2011, DCC purchased 124 units for detenanting across the city. In 2012, they turned just 67. But they do get housing units in other ways, right? They offer people accommodation that they may have coming on stream in older persons' complexes or whatever, and they get their houses back off them. So they do have some other options in terms of getting housing units back, to empty out the complexes. The question then becomes is what? There's a proposal in Trees Gardens for 103 units to be built at the front of the site, just as you come off Cork Street. That's what they're working on at the moment. We'll see how successful they are in that. Just some photographs. Ground floor flat in Trees Gardens. There's so many of them boarded up now. This is, like, we look at the O'Devney one, which is the end of the process. This is St. Trees. All of those ones on the bottom, and the one up on the left-hand side are boarded. And that's the way it happens. Another family moves out. The idea is that there's no re-tenanting, right? Once you've been earmarked for regeneration, that generally they don't re-tenant. That's slightly different in the complex we're going to talk about in a minute. Another shot of the blocks on the inside. Dolphin House is slightly different, and it's quite sexy at the moment because they were really good and they did they took a human rights-based approach to housing with the organisation CAN, Community Action Network, that Carl would know, and Matt are working with Tenants First at the moment. They really put it up to the City Council in Dublin and said, housing is a human right, and the quality and the conditions of the housing, people have a right to quality accommodation, right? Your sign, we'll come to the collective complaint idea in a minute, but our government is committed to all sorts of charters that we would honour those human rights. What they did was they got the science department in Maynooth to come and measure the damp levels in each of the flats, and they're really good at telling you what the spores are, right? Bacillus this and Bacillus that, right, within the flats. But they were able to present that evidence at a human rights hearing in Rialto a couple of years ago, and it was damning. And both RTE and Vincent Brown came and covered and gave huge coverage to the story. Like one of the women that she works for the youth project in Rialto, she has a daughter who her stomach has to be washed out every day, and with a hose that goes in and is taken out. And they went to the flat, and one of the problems with Dolphin House is that the sewage system is so old that it can't cope anymore. So everything is going back up into the flats from the bottom, right? So I haven't got. I actually have photos on the camera that I didn't get on here, but the physical conditions they're really becoming uninhabitable in that way. Especially if you have any health issues, they would have recorded increases in asthma, in people's health within the complex. So they're saying people can't live like this anymore. We want you to fix it. We want you to sort it. So they've got fantastic media coverage, and it was a really interesting tactical use of a human rights approach to put pressure on the City Council vis-a-vis and then the state to say to them, you need to honour your responsibilities that you have to the residents of these complexes. And so in a way the City Council has responded, right? So they're saying they don't have the money to fully refurbish the complex, but what they're doing is in Dolphin House, similar to the blocks in St. Teresa's Gardens that I just showed you, you've got two hallways. You see the way you've got a hallway here and a hallway here. So sometimes you'll have two flats on that side, one on that of each of the hallways. So you'll have 6 flats on that block from end to end. So what they're going to do is make 3 flats into 2, right? And put a lift up the centre of the blocks. That's the proposal, to completely restructure the sewage system, to rebuild it from scratch. To make the accommodation units bigger, to improve the quality and the standard of them, so that there's a master plan on the table for them at the moment in Dolphin in relation to changing the layout of the complex. So it proves that the pressure being applied works in some cases. Now, obviously, it's relative in relation to what they were reportedly going to get through PPP as to what they're going to get now in the context of at one stage it was completely new housing, whereas now it's refurbishment and regeneration. The one difference between Dolphin House and St. Teresa's is that there's a policy of re-tenanting if anybody moves out, which is really good because it holds the place together, right? And they can be, I'm not giving you romantic stories about living in places like Dolphin House. They're tough places to live in. But when you begin to de-tenant, the thing begins to fracture, right, completely. Because people become completely destabilised. If there's nobody living next to them here, over them, and gradually the place becomes emptied out. And that's what's happened in most of the complexes in O'Delny, Teresa's, Michael's, and it's not a way to live anywhere. These are just some conclusions in terms of the conditions on a site still become intolerable, right? Just that process of de-tenanting, where it leaves you, and the fallout, and in some ways it's not really taken seriously. The breakup of communities, of families and social networks. Along with that, like the austerity is doubling up in lots of ways on this in terms of the closure of critical community projects. Like I'm giving you a kind of silo version of housing, right? But alongside of that, like in December, there was a 13% cut to the community development programme, right? So what's happening now in lots of the community projects is that people are being asked, is there anybody in this project who could take voluntary redundancy because we don't have the money to run the project anymore? So that's paralleling the physical collapse of the project at the same time. So you've got youth workers in the project that I'm on the board of in Rialto. One of them is taking redundancy since last week because of the cut in last December's budget. You've got community development projects, the same stuff is going on there. You've got regeneration projects, the same stuff is going on there. And so with the best will in the world, the council will come in, but that having that powerful advocacy, tenant participation and driving that, it's the community projects who normally support and resource that. And let people get on and do it for themselves, brilliant. But that resource is really critical, and that's there being closed and cut. And the best example is O'Delny Gardens, where the two key regeneration workers funded by the City Council were stopped, the funding was stopped, as well as the other regeneration worker in the complex. So one of the questions we asked in the book was, who was regeneration for? So if you go back to the Michael's Estate example, builders came in there clearly with the objective of how many private apartments can we get and can we sell. Right? It wasn't about community stuff for it. It wasn't. It was purely with the numbers on the board. The plans looked great, right? but it was really a theoretical exercise. The people didn't exist to fill them. Right? They didn't. It was people would buy them, but they weren't going to live in them. Right? In that sense. So when the estates have been completely detenanted and demolished, another set of questions emerge because the council and the state will then propose it's not about housing anymore. We want the land, right? And we want the land for different uses or for what we want it for. And we would think that that's probably the next phase in this, in the sense of that, you know, once the detenanting is over, that it gives them all sorts of other options that they didn't have before. And we were talking just before I came in with Martin, like the excuses are endless now to say we need the revenue from the sale of that land for this or this or this. Just one of the actions, like as I said with tenants first, there's been a huge amount of stuff that's happened over the years. From we did the Real Guide to Regeneration, housing for need, not for greed. But probably the most important thing was bringing people together to say what was happening and learning from each other, even though the journey's been difficult and in many ways it's a waiting for Godot journey in lots of ways, but even having said that, I think people have learned a lot along the way. But who have worked on the human rights based approach in Dolphin House and who are really instrumental in using the human rights based approach in relation to the larger housing issue, have come to Tenants First as an organisation and said, would you be interested in using this to take a case to the European Union, right? The rights-based stuff is not binding legally, right? But morally, we would try and create such a huge case around this that the Irish state would have to respond, right? So the collective complaint is really about a group of organisations interested in housing rights coming together. to prove that the way Ireland's housing policy is designed and delivered results in the rights of local authority tenants, homeless people and travellers not being met. Right? So we use the articles in the European Social Charter to do this. Now, to me, that's a no-brainer. It's true, right? They're not being met. It's very, like when you see the complex, when you see the conditions. But the question is, how do you get that? Right? So we've been on protest after protest. We've written article after article. So I would say, yes, it's worth a shot. We'll try it, and we'll see how it goes in relation to trying to make a difference at that broader level to do that. The other question with the land still stands, but there are lots of places where people are there's still a substantial number of public housing complexes and adjacent complexes all over the city and all over the country. So one of the key things which was really good was the gathering of scientific data in a complex like Dolphin House to prove the case and to be able to say, to have a scientist stand up and say that scientifically the dampness in the flats in Dolphin House is affecting people's health chronically, right? To be able to make that case and to put the two things together had a huge effect. It had a huge effect in the media and it had a huge effect when people heard those stories and it also had a huge effect on the City Council in the context of somebody saying to them with status, these are the conditions in the complexes and the houses that people are living in. I'm not a rights expert and I'm not a legal person, but the idea is to prepare an initial complaint. You've got to have like an organisation who has the status to present it to the European Commission, right? The one we're thinking of is a group called Fiance, right? That they effectively put it forward, but it's really just a case of lodging the complaint, and that the European Committee of Social Rights will decide if the complaint stands. And if they allow the complaint after that initial stage, well then it really begins, right, to go forward. Like Cecilia Worsper was saying that the Irish government will absolutely reject, first of all, anything that's put forward especially given how contradictory it is in terms of being signed up to international covenants on human rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. But that the committee reads through all of the evidence and asks the government questions, and then the process ends with them making a judgment and recommendations. And there will be a media campaign. I think the media campaign around Dolphin House is really powerful in the context of, again, putting pressure on the state. That was the time there, Mark. Okay. And really, it's quite simple in a way. It's really about trying to make the Irish government live up to its responsibilities on housing that it has and that it doesn't deliver. So we use the European Social Charter of Human Rights as a lever. It's new to me. I'm, in the context of looking at it as a tool for change and as a pressure point to push and to press on and to say, are rights important? Are people's housing rights important? And if they are important, and you think they're important, well then we should meet them. And we should change the conditions that people are living in the complexes. The Irish government is a signatory to the Charter, but I think it hasn't signed up to the housing section. There's a bit of a question about that at the moment. There's a few other articles. I think there's 2 or 3 other articles in the Charter which are potential levers as well to take to the committee and to press the case home. But in a way, it's a new departure for us in the context of saying when your back is against the wall and you've done all sorts, you've taken all sorts of different actions, you've educated, you've informed, you've met, you've campaigned, and this is another stage in that process. The thing that it tells you is, like Rita Fagan, who works in me, and it's quite famous in her own right, but always say, how long does it take to change something, right? And what it proves is sometimes it takes a long time, but it continues, and she texted me this morning saying, tell the people in Limerick to get up and stand up for their housing. But so that idea is just it's a slightly different strategic decision about how we're going to win this fight about the housing. I'm just conscious of the time. Is that so? in a way, that's the history, that's the context, that's where we're at the moment. It doesn't really give, there's lots of detail in all of those complexes, and there's probably another book to be written about where the thing has gone from 2008 up until the present, in the sense of this phase of it. And there's a whole, like, one of my questions is that we've got to tie it to the bigger economic issues, right? We've got to tie it to the austerity, we've got to tie it into the fact that we're paying Anglo 3.1 billion at the end of March, and we've got to tie it to other campaigns that people are working on, at the same time. Like, I'm involved in the Anglo Not Our Debt stuff, but I didn't want to confuse this thing today, and maybe I'll just I know there'll be public meetings in Limerick soon around that, but if that debt is suspended, it makes a huge difference to the state's ability to be able to respond to issues like this. The debt payment on the 31st of March is the equivalent of the budget cuts in last December. Right? It's a quid pro quo. Same amount of money going on the 31st of December that was taken out of the budget. So that's that's how big it is in that sense. So maybe that's me. Is that all right?
Nice job.